Ladies and gentlemen, why the Alaska summit changed everything for India is not just another international story. It is a turning point, a moment in time that showed the world a side of India they had either ignored, underestimated, or simply could not understand. You see, power doesn't always reveal itself in bombs, missiles, or GDP charts. Sometimes, true power is revealed in silence, in patience, in the way you show up to the table when others think you're too weak to sit with them. That summit in Alaska, the one people thought was just another diplomatic handshake, became a mirror, and in that mirror, India saw itself differently, and the world was forced to adjust its eyes, because suddenly the reflection staring back wasn't the same old India they thought they knew. It was sharper, bolder, unapologetic, and prepared for the future in ways nobody could deny anymore. The reason this moment matters is because up until then, the world's narrative about India was almost always written by someone else. It was the West saying India is a developing country, struggling with poverty, torn between tradition and technology. It was China saying India is chaotic, fragmented, a place that could never organize itself to rise as a global power. It was Pakistan pointing fingers, hoping that its noise could overshadow India's progress. But at that Alaska summit, India didn't just show up to listen. India showed up to remind everyone that it has its own voice, and that voice carried the weight of one. 4 billion people, a civilizational history older than any empire still breathing, and a future too massive to ignore. What makes this summit different is the stage it was set on. Alaska, a place symbolic of American strategy, a land of cold winds and unshakable strength, became the ground where nations came together to measure each other's will. America came in with its usual confidence, China with its sharp words, but India's presence shocked both sides. Not because India shouted the loudest, not because India flexed its muscles, but because India carried itself with a calm power that shook the arrogance in the room. When your opponent expects you to bow, but instead you stand with quiet certainty, that's when they realize they are no longer dealing with the same player. That was India's moment, and let me tell you why this silence, this calm, is far more dangerous than any missile. The world is used to countries screaming for attention. They're used to threats, chest beating, sanctions, and dramatic announcements. But India didn't play that game. India chose dignity. India chose discipline. And discipline is the highest form of strength. Think about it. The man who can control his emotions in the middle of chaos will always defeat the one who loses his temper. The nation that can smile while being provoked, that can stay patient when pushed, that can observe when others are blind with anger. That nation is the one the world quietly fears. After Alaska, the conversation around India changed. Suddenly, analysts who once dismissed India as a junior partner were asking, wait, how did India manage to hold its ground so firmly against two superpowers? Journalists who once only wrote about India's problems were now writing about India's strategy. Businesses who once hesitated to invest were suddenly dialing phones to explore opportunities. And ordinary people across continents started seeing India not as the land of call centers or spirituality alone, but as a serious contender in shaping the 21st century. What most people don't realize is that this shift was not accidental. India had been preparing for this for decades, slowly building its military, not for aggression but for deterrence, slowly shaping its economy, not for show, but for resilience, slowly crafting its diplomacy, not to win headlines, but to win respect. And at Alaska, all those years of patience paid off, because the strongest moves in history are never made overnight. They are the result of years of quiet planning, the kind of preparation that nobody notices until suddenly you make a move and everyone gasps, where did that come from? That was India's play. Now let me tell you why the world was truly shaken. It wasn't just that India stood tall. It was the fact that India refused to be pulled into someone else's war of words. When America and China were trading accusations, India didn't jump in to take sides. India didn't fall into the trap of being a pawn in their great power rivalry. Instead, India positioned itself as the alternative, the balancing force, the player who doesn't need to shout because its very presence shifts the balance of power. That's chess. While others were busy playing checkers, India quietly moved into the queen's position. The truth is, India understood something the rest of the world often forgets. Real power is not about dominating others, it's about making yourself indispensable. The Alaska summit revealed that the global order is no longer bipolar, no longer just about Washington and Beijing. It's multipolar, and in that multipolar world, India has become the anchor no one can ignore. Whether it's technology, defense, supply chains, or diplomacy, you cannot have a serious conversation about the future without India at the table. That was the revelation of Alaska, and let me break it down even deeper. America realized in that moment that if it wants to counter China, it cannot do it without India. China realized that if it wants to dominate Asia, it cannot do it without confronting India, and both realized that if they underestimate India, they do so at their own risk. That is the first time in modern history where both superpowers had to admit to themselves. India is no longer the background player, it is a front-row power, but here's the part most people miss. The Alaska Summit, it was not just about foreign policy. It was about psychology, because power is first a game of perception. If you see yourself as weak, the world will treat you as weak. But if you walk into the room believing you belong, even the giants will adjust their chairs to make space for you. At Alaska, India's representatives walked in with that belief, that quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from preparation, and once the world saw that, there was no going back. India stopped asking for permission at that summit. India stopped seeking validation. Instead, India showed the world that it has its own terms, its own path, its own destiny. And that kind of self-belief, when projected onto a stage as large as Alaska, becomes contagious. It forces allies, rivals, even skeptics to recalculate their positions. Suddenly, countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America started to think, if India can stand its ground between America and China, maybe India is the partner we should be betting on. That's how soft power turns into real power, all right. It marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine, backed by innovation. It symbolized the birth of a multipolar order where India stands as an anchor, not a bystander. For decades, people thought India was just a participant in global discussions, someone invited to the table, but never the one flipping it upside down. But when the Alaska summit unfolded, the narrative changed forever. It was the moment the world realized that India was not waiting for permission anymore, not waiting for validation, not asking whether it could lead. It was the moment when the world saw India step forward with clarity, with confidence, and with a sense of destiny that could not be denied. You see, military power today is not just about tanks, missiles, or the size of your army. Military power today is about brains, innovation, and the courage to integrate technology with strategy. India's doctrine was no longer reactive, no longer built on the idea of simply defending borders and waiting for the next strike. At Alaska, it became clear to everyone paying attention that India's doctrine had matured into something the world must now respect and fear. An assertive doctrine backed by innovation meant India was not just preparing to fight yesterday's wars, it was preparing to dominate tomorrow's conflict. The doctrines of the past were defensive, built on the trauma of invasions and colonial exploitation. But the doctrine born around Alaska was proactive, futuristic, and aligned with India's role as a civilizational power that had finally decided to reclaim its rightful place, the Alaska Sum. It was not about paper agreements or symbolic handshakes. It was about perception, and perception is power. When generals, diplomats, and global leaders left those rooms, they carried back a message that India was no longer the swing vote in global affairs. India was the anchor. In a multipolar world, the anchor matters more than the storm. Without an anchor, the whole ship drifts, and in that moment, India became the stabilizer, the country that others would measure themselves against. This is why China felt uneasy, why America recalculated its moves, why Russia leaned in more closely, and why Europe suddenly realized they could not afford to ignore New Delhi. The anchor had been dropped, and it was heavy enough to hold the weight of shifting tides. You cannot talk about this doctrine without talking about innovation. Think about drones, artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, cyber warfare, and space-based defense. India was not following anymore. It was leading. Quietly, without announcing every move, India had been building an arsenal that combined old school resilience with new age creativity. It was the kind of arsenal that said, "We are not trying to copy America or China. We are creating something uniquely ours." That mindset of innovation is what scared everyone, because a predictable adversary is manageable, but an unpredictable one, driven by creativity, is dangerous. The Alaska summit forced the world to confront India's unpredictability, its willingness to act on its own terms, and its ability to back it up with both brains and muscle. Now imagine this. For the longest time, global power was defined by 2 or 3 poles, America at the top, Russia as the challenger, China rising in the background. Everyone else was either orbiting these poles or trying to survive in between. But Alaska showed that those days were gone. Multipolarity was no longer a theory, it was a fact. And India was not just another pole, not just a balancing act, but an anchor. That meant when conflicts break out, when trade wars escalate, when energy routes are threatened, when technology controls the future, India would not be an audience. It would be a referee, sometimes even the player scoring the decisive goal. A multipolar world without India at the center simply cannot exist anymore. And that's what Alaska confirmed. Let's talk psychology for a second. Power is not only about weapons. It is about how others perceive your resolve. At Alaska, Indian representatives walked in with a presence, a kind of quiet confidence that unsettled everyone. It was not arrogance, it was certainty, and certainty in geopolitics is the deadliest weapon. Certainty tells your rivals you cannot be moved, cannot be bribed, cannot be manipulated. India projected certainty, not desperation. This was not the India of the 90s begging for loans or approvals. This was the India of the 21st century telling the world, "We don't need your approval, we need respect." That shift in psychology was what transformed the doctrine from a piece of paper into a living reality. What people missed is that Alaska was never just about India versus others. It was about India versus its own past. For centuries, India had been pushed into the role of a victim, a country of endless potential but never of decisive power. That image was shattered when innovation met doctrine. It meant India was no longer looking back at what it lost, but forward at what it could shape. It meant India could design military strategies that didn't just defend its soil, but extended its influence across oceans, into cyberspace, into the hearts of allies and adversaries alike. It meant that India was rewriting its story, not as a follower, but as a forger of destiny. When I say multipolarity was born that day, I mean it in the truest sense. America realized it could not dictate terms unilaterally anymore. China realized bullying would not go unanswered. Russia realized India was not just a friend but an independent force. Smaller nations realized they could lean on India as a protector, a partner, or even a model. The entire world's diplomatic architecture shifted because India's doctrine signaled something crucial. Predictability was dead, and a new balance had arrived. Multipolarity is not about chaos, it is about balance. And balance only comes when there is an anchor strong enough to resist both the wind and the storm. That anchor was India, what is the most dangerous enemy in modern geopolitics. Not the biggest army, not the richest economy, not even the deadliest weapons. The most dangerous enemy is the one who refuses to play by your rules, who writes their own rulebook and has the means to enforce it. At Alaska, the world realized India was that enemy for anyone who thought they could dictate its choices. That's why the doctrine born there was assertive. It was not defensive, not apologetic, not dependent. It was unapologetic. It said, we will do what we must, when we must, how we must, and nobody will stop us. That mindset is what defines anchors in a multipolar order. Not neutrality, not silence, but unapologetic independence backed by innovation. And let's not forget the ripple effects. After Alaska, trade talks changed, security alliances shifted, investment patterns moved. Countries began to court India differently. Why? Because they saw the doctrine as more than just military. It was economic, it was cultural, it was civilizational. When a nation decides it is an anchor, it doesn't just build weapons, it builds narratives. India began projecting itself as a civilization, state, not just another modern republic. That's when people outside started realizing this is not just about missiles, this is about 5,000 years of continuity married with cutting-edge technology. That combination is terrifying for rivals and inspiring for allies when you look back. You will see Alaska as the dividing line. Before Alaska, India was treated as a rising power. After Alaska, India was acknowledged as an existing power. Before Alaska, multipolarity was an idea. After Alaska, multipolarity became the operating system of global politics. Before Alaska, India was a participant. After Alaska, India became the anchor. And anchors don't ask permission. Anchors hold the ship in place, whether the storm likes it or not.